Sometimes, life has a way of turning everything you thought you knew upside down. My name is Matt, and I'm 32 years old. This story isn't just about heartbreak, it's about betrayal, greed, and the cold realization that the person you trusted most was playing you all along. Growing up in a wealthy family came with its perks, but also its burdens. My parents left me a massive trust fund, something most people would kill for, but it wasn't handed to me on a silver platter. They made sure I understood the value of hard work. Still, no amount of preparation could have prepared me for what happened next. I met Sarah during my sophomore year at college at a party, of all places. She stood out because she didn't seem to care about who I was or how much money my last name carried. At first glance, she was different, genuine, unpretentious, and refreshingly real. We bonded over late-night conversations, shared laughter, and even silly arguments about nothing important. It felt like fate had brought us together. Within months, we were inseparable. To everyone around us, including my parents, Sarah seemed perfect, smart, kind, and completely disinterested in my wealth, or so I thought. Our relationship moved fast, almost too fast. After only a year of dating, I proposed. I wasn't one to waste time when I knew someone was the one, and Sarah, she said yes without hesitation. The wedding was extravagant, paid for by my family, and attended by everyone who mattered. For 6 years, we lived what looked like a fairy tale from the outside: a beautiful home, successful careers, and a seemingly happy marriage. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, cracks I refused to see until it was too late. What I didn't realize then was that Sarah's charm masked a calculated plan. Looking back, the signs were there, subtle but undeniable. Her sudden interest in discussing finances, her frequent absences under the guise of work trips, and the way she subtly probed me about the trust fund, all red flags I ignored. I wanted to believe in her innocence, in us. But Sarah wasn't the woman I fell in love with. She was an imposter, waiting for the right moment to strike. And strike she did. One day, while I was grieving the loss of both my parents within 6 months, Sarah disappeared with another man. Not just any man, but her boss, Nick. They ran off to Italy, leaving behind not only their lives but also the wreckage of my shattered world. That's where this nightmare truly began. Little did they know, though, that their escape wouldn't go as planned. Because I wasn't going to let them walk away with everything: not my dignity, not my future, and certainly not my family's legacy. As the months turned into years, cracks began to form in what I once thought was an unbreakable foundation. Looking back now, it's clear that Sarah had been laying the groundwork for her betrayal long before I realized anything was wrong. But at the time, I was too blind, too trusting to see the signs. They were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like whispers of a storm on the horizon. The first red flag came when Sarah started traveling more frequently for work. At first, it seemed normal. She worked in advertising, after all, and client meetings were part of the job. But soon her trips became longer, more frequent, and increasingly vague. She'd call me sometimes, but something about those calls felt off. Her voice would waver between forced cheerfulness and barely concealed tension, as if she were trying to keep me at arm's length while maintaining the illusion of connection. One night, during one of these calls, I heard a faint laugh in the background. Not hers, the man's laugh. My stomach churned, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a coworker, or maybe I misheard. After all, Sarah wasn't the type to cheat, right? She'd always been so independent, so self-assured, and besides, we had built our life together over 6 years. How could I let paranoia creep in now? So, I dismissed it, burying my doubts under layers of denial. I wanted to believe in us, in her. But deep down, the seed of suspicion had already taken root. Things only grew worse after my parents passed away. Losing them both within 6 months of each other shattered me in ways I didn't think possible. I buried myself in work, trying to distract myself from the gaping void their deaths left behind. I poured every ounce of energy into running the company, hoping that keeping busy would dull the pain. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed distant. At first, I chalked it up to grief. Everyone processes loss differently, and perhaps she needed space to cope with her own emotions. But as the weeks dragged on, her behavior became harder to ignore. She stopped asking how I was doing. Not once did she sit down with me to talk about my feelings or offer comfort. It was as if my world crumbling around me didn't matter to her at all. What hurt most wasn't just her absence, it was her indifference. When I tried to open up to her about how much I missed my parents, how lost I felt without them, she brushed me off. "You're always working," she said one evening, her tone sharp and accusatory. "Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with your job, you'd have time to deal with your emotions." Her words stung, not because they were true, they weren't, but because they revealed a side of her I hadn't seen before. Where was the supportive partner who promised to stand by me through thick and thin? Had she ever truly cared, or was this all some elaborate act? And then there were the little things, the moments that, in hindsight, screamed betrayal. Like the way she suddenly became interested in discussing finances, probing me about the trust fund with questions that felt oddly calculated. Or the times she'd disappear into her office late at night, locking the door behind her, claiming she was catching up on emails. Once, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen when she left it unattended on the kitchen counter. There was a string of messages from someone named Nick, her boss, though I didn't know his name at the time. The texts were cryptic, but the tone was unmistakably flirtatious. Again, I chose to look away, convincing myself I was overreacting. After all, Sarah had never given me a reason to doubt her fidelity, or so I thought. But the cracks kept widening, until the facade couldn't hold anymore. By the time I came home early with roses, thinking I could salvage whatever was left of our marriage, the truth hit me like a freight train. Sarah wasn't just emotionally distant, she was gone, physically and spiritually. Standing in that living room, watching her walk out with Nick, I finally understood everything I had believed about our relationship was a lie. The signs had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, but I had refused to see them. Now, staring at the wreckage of my life, I realized the cost of my blindness. The betrayal hit me like a freight train, but what made it worse was the cold, calculated precision with which Sarah executed her plan. It wasn't just about leaving me, it was about taking everything she could get her hands on before walking out the door. I didn't realize it at first, not until I stumbled upon something that sent my world spiraling into chaos. One evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing our joint account statements, something I rarely did, I noticed an anomaly. A massive withdrawal had been made only days earlier. The amount, enough to make my stomach churn. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of error or perhaps a business expense I'd forgotten about, but deep down, I knew better. My gut told me this wasn't coincidence, it was sabotage. Panic set in as I scrolled through the transactions, searching for answers. There were no explanations, no notes attached to the withdrawal. Just a gaping hole where thousands of dollars used to be. I felt sick. Not because of the money itself, I'd always known wealth came with risks, but because this wasn't just theft, it was personal. Sarah had taken something far more valuable than cash to trust. And now, every ounce of doubt I'd suppressed over the past year came rushing back like a tidal wave. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she'd betrayed me financially, too. 2 weeks after discovering the missing funds, I decided to come home early from work. For once, I wanted to surprise Sarah, to show her that despite everything going wrong in my life, I still cared. I stopped by a flower shop and picked up a bouquet of roses, hard ones, thinking maybe we could reconnect, mend whatever cracks had formed between us. Little did I know, fate had other plans. As I walked through the front door, the sight before me froze me in place. Sarah and Nick, her boss, the man whose name had haunted my nightmares, were standing in the living room, surrounded by suitcases. They weren't just planning a weekend getaway, they were leaving, permanently. Nick looked smug, leaning casually against the armrest of the couch, his designer watch glinting under the chandelier light. He glanced at me briefly, almost dismissively, as if he owned the place. But it was Sarah who stole my breath away, not because of her beauty, but because of the icy detachment in her eyes. Gone was the warmth I once loved, replaced by a steely resolve that left no room for negotiation. Before I could even process what I was seeing, she spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't need to wait for a goodbye note," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "I'm leaving, Matt." Those words shattered me. Every syllable felt like a dagger piercing my chest. I stood there, frozen, clutching the bouquet of roses like a fool, while the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with prepared to abandon me without so much as a second glance. Her words weren't just cruel, they were final. She didn't care about sparing my feelings or offering some semblance of closure. No, this was a declaration of war. She had chosen him, chosen greed, chosen a future built on lies. And in that moment, I realized how blind I had been. All those late-night trips, all those cryptic phone calls, it had all led to this. But what hurt most wasn't the act of betrayal itself, it was the realization that Sarah had never intended to stay. Everything we had built together, the house, the memories, the promises, was nothing more than a facade. She had played me, manipulated me, and now she was walking away as if none of it mattered. Nick chimed in then, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Matt, man, let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he said, flashing a grin that made my blood boil. Harder? Was he serious? Did he really think this was difficult for him? I wanted to scream, to throw the roses at them, to demand answers. But instead, I stood there, paralyzed, as they grabbed their bags and headed for the door. Sarah paused for a brief moment, her hand hovering near the doorknob. For a split second, I thought she might say something, anything to soften the blow, but she didn't. Instead, she turned to look at me one last time, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she walked out, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. The betrayal had already shattered me, but what Megan revealed next was like pouring salt into an open wound. Desperation had driven me to reach out to her, Sarah's supposed best friend, after days of sleepless nights and unanswered texts. I wasn't proud of snooping through Sarah's phone to find Megan's number, but at that point, my trust in humanity and in Sarah was hanging by a thread. When Megan finally answered my call, her voice was hesitant, almost guilty. "Matt, is everything okay?" she asked, her tone laced with unease. I could hear the tension in her voice, and it only fueled my resolve. "I need to know the truth," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of emotions I couldn't suppress. "Sarah left me for Nick. How long has this been going on?" There was a long pause on the other end, so long that I thought she might hang up. But then she sighed, a heavy, defeated sigh. "Matt, I'm sorry. I didn't want to be involved in any of this. It's been about a year. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My knees nearly buckled as I gripped the edge of the table for support. A year. They had been lying to me, deceiving me, for an entire year while I was busy trying to keep our lives together. But Megan wasn't done yet. What she said next sent chills down my spine. "Sarah, she's been planning this for a while. She even consulted a lawyer about the trust fund. She thought she'd be set, no matter what happened." My blood ran cold. The trust fund, of course, it wasn't just about love or passion, it was always about money. Megan hesitated again before continuing, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "She told me once, she said Nick didn't have to worry about anything because she had it all figured out. She said they'd live their dream life in Italy, and the money would take care of everything." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Every word Megan spoke was a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. I demanded to see proof, and reluctantly, she agreed to send me screenshots of some of Sarah's emails to Nick. When they arrived, I couldn't believe what I was reading. One email stood out, its contents seared into my mind like a brand. "We'll live the life we've always dreamed of in Italy, and you won't have to worry about money. I've calculated everything." Calculated. The word echoed in my head, mocking me. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had meticulously planned every step of her escape, treating our marriage like nothing more than a transaction. The audacity of it made me sick, Sarah had played me like a pawn in her grand scheme, manipulating my trust and exploiting my vulnerability after my parents' deaths. I remembered how distant she had been during that time, how she never once asked how I was coping. Now it all made sense. She hadn't been grieving alongside me, she had been plotting her exit strategy, calculating how much she could take before walking away. And Nick, he was just as complicit, feeding into her greed and selfishness. Together, they were a toxic duo, united by lies and ambition. As I stared at the screen, rereading Sarah's words over and over, something inside me snapped. The pain was still there, raw and unrelenting, but it was overshadowed by a growing rage. How dare she? How dare they? They thought they could use me, discard me, and walk away with my family's legacy without consequences. But they were wrong, dead wrong. I clenched my fists, my knuckles turning white as I vowed to myself that they wouldn't get away with it, not a single penny. My parents had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, for their wealth to be squandered by two opportunistic liars. Megan's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Matt, are you still there?" I realized I hadn't said anything in minutes. "Yeah," I replied, my voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Thanks for telling me. I needed to know." We ended the call shortly after, but her words lingered in my mind. She had warned me that Sarah and Nick weren't just running away for love, they were running away to secure a future built on stolen dreams. And now, armed with the truth, I was ready to fight back. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. For my parents, for myself, for the life they tried to destroy. The moment Sarah walked out of my life with Nick, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her take everything down with her. My parents had worked too hard for their legacy to be squandered by someone who didn't even care about it. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer, someone sharp, someone who could help me navigate the mess Sarah and Nick were trying to leave behind. Sitting in that sterile office, recounting every betrayal, every lie, felt like ripping open a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. But as painful as it was, I needed clarity. I needed control. The lawyer listened intently, his expression unreadable but professional. When I mentioned the trust fund, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Matt," he said, his voice steady, "this isn't just about divorce. It's about protecting what your family built." He explained how my parents had structured the trust to ensure it couldn't easily be accessed by outsiders. Still, Sarah's name being tied to certain accounts during our marriage meant she might have tried to exploit loopholes. That's when we discovered something chilling. Sarah had attempted to transfer assets from the family business into personal accounts under her name. She wasn't just after the trust fund, she wanted to bleed the company dry. My stomach churned at the thought of her betrayal running so deep. How long had she been planning this? Had she ever cared about me? Or was I simply a pawn in her game? The lawyer assured me that these transfers were legal and could be reversed, but it only fueled my determination to make sure Sarah paid for her greed. Every document we reviewed, every email trail we uncovered, painted a clearer picture of her calculated scheme. It wasn't just about love or passion, it was always about money. And now, armed with evidence, I was ready to fight back. But then came the unexpected twist. Hannah, Nick's wife, showed up at my door. At first, I didn't know what to say. What do you say to the woman whose husband is sleeping with your wife? But Hannah didn't give me time to process. She stepped inside, her face pale but resolute. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and unwavering. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of our shared betrayal hung heavy in the air. Hannah broke the silence first. "I know what they've been doing," she began, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her bag. "Nick, he's been lying to me for months. He thinks he can run off with Sarah and live some fantasy life in Italy. But here's the thing, they're not as smart as they think." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. As much as I hated Nick, hearing Hannah confirm their deceit made it all feel more real, more raw. She went on to explain that Nick wasn't just relying on Sarah for companionship, he was depending on her financially. Apparently, Nick's own business was drowning in debt, and he saw Sarah as his ticket out of trouble. Nick thought Sarah would get access to your trust fund, Hannah continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. He believed she'd bail him out, cover his debts, and they'd live happily ever after. But he didn't count on one thing you. Her confidence surprised me. Despite everything, Hannah wasn't broken. She was furious, determined to reclaim what was rightfully hers and to destroy Nick in the process. Together, we began piecing together a plan. Hannah revealed that Nick had been funneling company funds into offshore accounts, hoping to shield himself from creditors. If we exposed him, it wouldn't just ruin his reputation, it could land him in jail. Together, we began piecing together a plan. Hannah revealed that Nick had been funneling company funds into offshore accounts, hoping to shield himself from creditors. If we exposed him, it wouldn't just ruin his reputation, it could land him in jail. We agreed to share information, coordinate with our lawyers, and strike before they could regroup. For the first time since Sarah left, I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And if there was one thing I learned from my parents, it was that justice was worth fighting for. The culmination of months of legal maneuvering, emotional turmoil, and sheer determination finally came to a head when Sarah and Nick returned from their ill-fated escape to Italy. What they expected to be the beginning of their dream life turned into a nightmare, one they had no way out of. The trust fund, which had been the cornerstone of their grand plan, was now an impenetrable fortress thanks to my relentless efforts with my lawyer and financial advisor. Every loophole they thought they could exploit had been sealed shut. When they stepped off that plane, reality hit them like a freight train. Their fantasy of living lavishly at my expense was over before it even began. Nick was the first to reach out, his desperation palpable in every word. I still remember the day he called Thursday afternoon, sitting in my office trying to focus on work while the weight of everything hung heavy in the air. My phone buzzed, and when I saw his name flash across the screen, I almost laughed out loud. Why would he call me? Did he think I'd forgotten everything he'd done? Curiosity got the better of me, so I answered, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Hello. There was a pause on the other end, followed by Nick's attempt at sounding casual, like we were old friends catching up. Hey Matt, man, he started, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. I just wanted to. I'll clear the air between us. Clear the air? My jaw tightened as anger surged through me. This man had stolen my wife, shattered my marriage, and now he wanted to clear the air. I bit back my initial retort, letting him stumble through his rehearsed apology. I know things have been kind of tense, but I just want you to know this wasn't personal. It just happened. That was the moment I lost control. Not personal. I snapped, my voice cutting through the line like a blade. You're sleeping with my wife, Nick. How exactly is that not personal? He stammered, clearly unprepared for my reaction, then tried to backtrack with some pathetic chuckle. Look, man, you're upset, but let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah and I are serious about each other, and I think it'd be best if we all just moved on. Moved on, as if betraying me and running off with my money was something we could simply brush under the rug. I couldn't believe the audacity of this man. Oh, don't worry, Nick, I said, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. I'm moving on. In fact, I've already talked to my lawyer. Sarah isn't getting a dime, and neither are you. For a brief second, there was silence on the other end. I could practically hear the panic setting in as he processed what I'd just said. Then, without another word, he hung up. It was satisfying, in a way, knowing that he finally realized his gravy train had derailed, but it wasn't enough, not yet. Sarah's return was inevitable, and when it came, it was anything but pleasant. On a Monday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from her. We need to talk. No greeting, no pretense of civility, just those 4 words that sent a chill down my spine. I knew this moment was coming, but seeing it written out made it feel real in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I went about my day, forcing myself to stay composed, refusing to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much this was affecting me. When I got home that evening, she was waiting outside my house, sitting in her car like she still belonged there. Seeing her again after weeks apart felt surreal, almost like stepping into a bad dream. She stepped out of her car, trying and failing to appear calm. Her eyes betrayed her panic. "Matt," she began, walking toward me. "We really need to talk." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I crossed my arms and leaned against my car, letting her squirm. She hesitated, and used to me not rushing to fix things, before blurting out, "I know you've been talking to a lawyer." I raised an eyebrow, watching as she took a step closer, her voice growing more desperate. "Matt, this doesn't have to go down like this. We can figure it out. There's no need to drag lawyers into this." I almost laughed. Drag lawyers into this? After everything she'd done, she thought we could settle this with a simple conversation. "I'm not the one who brought lawyers into this, Sarah," I replied, my voice icy. "You left me. You made that decision. Now you're going to have to live with the consequences." Her composure cracked, and for a moment, she looked genuinely rattled. "I didn't want it to be like this," she pleaded, her voice softening. "I still care about you, Matt. But things just happened. I wasn't happy. You were always working." I felt alone. My anger flared, but I kept it in check. "Instead of talking to me about it, you ran off with Nick," I shot back. She flushed, looking down at the ground. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't planned. It just developed." "Developed?" I repeated, incredulous. "You expect me to believe that this just developed out of nowhere? You've been with him for a year, Sarah. A year. Don't stand there and pretend like this wasn't a choice," she faltered, searching for anything to say. And then, predictably, she went for the trust fund. "I know about the trust," she said, her voice firmer now. "We both know your parents set it up for us. I'm still entitled to my share. That was the final straw. You're not getting a dime, Sarah," I said, my frustration boiling over. "The trust was never for you. It was for me. And my lawyer has already made sure you won't see a cent." Her eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear cross her face. "Matt, you can't do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I gave you 6 years of my life. You can't just cut me out like this." I stood tall, meeting her gaze head-on. "You walked out, Sarah. You gave up on us. And now you think you're entitled to the life my parents worked for. No, you made your bed. Now lie in it." Tears streamed down her face as she begged, revealing the truth behind her visit. "Please, Matt. I don't know what to do. Nick's job isn't stable. We've got debts. They're going to take our property in Italy." It was clear now, she wasn't here because she cared about me or our marriage. She was here because she needed me to bail her out. For a fleeting moment, guilt tugged at me, but then I remembered the woman standing before me was not the same woman I fell in love with. That woman was gone, replaced by someone willing to destroy everything for greed. "I'm sorry you're struggling, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. "But that's not my problem anymore." Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car, defeated. As I watched her drive away, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over, finally. Just when I thought the chaos Sarah and Nick had unleashed on my life couldn't get any worse, fate decided to throw another curveball. It started with a phone call from Hannah again. By now, our alliance had become something of a lifeline for both of us. She wasn't just Nick's wife anymore, she was my partner in unraveling the mess they'd created. "Matt," her voice trembled over the line, "you're not going to believe this. Nick, he's being investigated." My stomach dropped. "Investigated? For what?" But before I could ask, she continued, her tone sharp with anger. "It turns out he's been funneling money through offshore accounts using information Sarah stole from your company." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Stolen information from my company. The same company my father had built from nothing, the one I'd poured my heart into keeping alive after his death. Sarah hadn't just betrayed me emotionally or financially, she had crossed the line I never imagined she'd dare approach. As Hannah explained further, the pieces fell into place. Sarah had used her access to confidential data from my family's business to help Nick cover up illegal transactions. They weren't just running off to Italy for a luxurious escape, they were laundering money, hiding debts, and trying to secure their future at the expense of everything I held dear. But the worst part, this wasn't just about greed, it was personal. Sarah knew exactly how much the company meant to me. She knew how hard I worked to honor my parents' legacy, yet she exploited it without hesitation. Every document she photocopied, every email she forwarded, every late-night meeting she claimed was work-related suddenly made sense. It wasn't just about love or even the trust fund anymore, it was about power, control, and destroying everything I cared about. Then came the message that sealed their fate and mine. Late one night, as I sat in my office reviewing the latest updates from my lawyer, my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. At first glance, it seemed desperate, almost pleading. But as I read it, my blood ran cold. "You think you've won, Nat?" It began, her usual charm replaced by venomous rage. "If you don't help us, I'll expose everything. All your family's secrets, the shady deals, the loopholes, the skeletons in your closet. You'll lose more than just me. You'll lose everything." For a moment, I froze. Was she bluffing? Did she really have dirt on my family, or was this just another attempt to manipulate me? Memories of my parents' sacrifices flooded back, their tireless work ethic, their integrity, their refusal to cut corners, no matter how tempting it might have been. If there were secrets, they weren't mine to hide. And if Sarah thought she could use them against me, she was sorely mistaken. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I typed my response: "Do what you want. I have nothing left to lose." Hitting send felt like releasing a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Sarah's threats no longer scared me because I understood something she didn't. I had already lost everything that truly mattered. My marriage, my trust, my sense of security, all of it was gone. What she failed to grasp was that her betrayal had freed me in a way I never expected. Without those illusions holding me back, I was untouchable. The next few days passed in a blur of legal filings and police interviews. Investigators combed through Nick's records, uncovering layer after layer of corruption. Hannah provided crucial evidence: emails between Sarah and Nick detailing their schemes, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, and even recordings of conversations where they discussed exploiting my family's assets. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of their greed and recklessness. Meanwhile, Sarah grew increasingly desperate. Her texts turned frantic, her messages laced with accusations and pleas, but I ignored them all. There was no point engaging with someone who had already proven themselves unworthy of my time. When the authorities finally arrested Nick, Sarah was dragged into the investigation too. Watching her name splashed across headlines for fraud and embezzlement was surreal. The woman who once walked into my life with such confidence now stood accused of crimes that would haunt her forever. Yet, despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, I couldn't shake the sadness lingering beneath it all. This wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, not for myself, not for anyone involved. But perhaps that was the lesson. Sometimes, closure doesn't come wrapped in triumph. Sometimes, it comes in the form of acceptance that people aren't always who they seem, and forgiveness isn't always possible. The aftermath of Sarah's betrayal left me hollow, like a shell of the person I used to be. For months, I wrestled with anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of failure. How could I have been so blind? How did I not see the cracks forming in our marriage until it was too late? The truth was painful but unavoidable. I had trusted too easily, loved too deeply, and ignored the warning signs that should have screamed louder than they did. Sarah wasn't just my wife, she was supposed to be my partner, my confidant, the one person who would stand by me no matter what. Instead, she turned out to be a master manipulator, someone who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. But through the wreckage of my shattered life, I began to piece together something unexpected: clarity. It wasn't immediate. It took weeks of sleepless nights, endless conversations with Hannah, and countless hours staring at the ceiling while replaying every moment of my relationship with Sarah. What I realized was this: I had let fear dictate my actions. Fear of being alone, fear of confrontation, fear of losing the life I thought I wanted. And because of that fear, I allowed myself to be taken advantage of. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't change the past, but I could damn well protect my future. I started small, making deliberate choices to reclaim control over my life. First, I tightened the legal safeguards around the trust fund, ensuring that no one, not Sarah, not Nick, not anyone could ever exploit it again. Then, I threw myself into work, not out of obligation, but because it gave me purpose. My parents built their company from scratch, and I owed it to them to keep it thriving. But beyond work, I made time for myself. For the first time in years, I prioritized my own happiness. I reconnected with old friends, joined a local hiking group, and even tried painting, a hobby I hadn't touched since college. Each step felt like shedding layers of bitterness, replacing them with something lighter, freer. And then, when I least expected it, love found me again. Her name was Claire, and she couldn't have been more different from Sarah. Where Sarah was polished and calculating, Claire was raw and genuine. We met at a charity event, one of those stuffy galas I usually avoided, but there she was, standing near the dessert table, laughing about how ridiculous the three-tiered chocolate fountain looked. Something about her laugh caught my attention, and before I knew it, we were talking. She didn't know who I was at first, which was refreshing. When she eventually asked what I did for a living, I braced myself for the usual reaction, the widened eyes, the awkward compliments, but none of that came. Instead, she nodded politely and changed the subject, asking if I'd tried the macarons yet. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other at coffee shops, bookstores, even the grocery store. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but later, she admitted she'd been subtly engineering these chance encounters. I figured if you liked me half as much as I liked you, it wouldn't hurt to bump into you a few times, she joked during one of our early dates. There was no pretense with Claire, no hidden agenda. She cared about people, not possessions, and she made it clear from the start that she wasn't interested in my money. In fact, she teased me whenever I offered to pay for things, insisting on splitting bills or treating me to dinner herself. Being with Claire taught me something profound. True happiness doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from trust, vulnerability, and shared experiences. With her, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I didn't have to guard my words or second-guess her intentions. She challenged me to grow, to confront the parts of myself I'd buried under layers of resentment, and to embrace the possibility of a new beginning. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not just surviving, but truly living. Looking back now, I realized that Sarah's betrayal wasn't just a curse, it was also a blessing in disguise. It forced me to confront my weaknesses, to rebuild my life on firmer ground, and to recognize the value of authenticity. Claire reminded me that love isn't about perfection, it's about connection. And while the scars of my past will always linger, they no longer define me. They're reminders of where I've been and how far I've come. Today, I'm stronger, wiser, and happier than I ever thought possible. And for the first time, I believe I deserve it.